Wales, CEO of the World Affairs Council, and is this on? Good. We welcome you here today. Tonight, the program will be focused on Iran. Its title is War with Iran Inevitable? Rethinking U.S. Strategic Options. Our speakers will be Ambassador William Luers. Bill Luers was our ambassador to the Czech Republic, and he's headed up a study that you will hear about tonight. Ambassador Frank Wisner, who was the Undersecretary of Policy at the Defense Department during the Clinton years, and he has served as ambassador to India and U.S. ambassador to Egypt, among many distinguished positions, and Admiral Eric Olson, former commander of strategic operations. I want to welcome three groups of people. There's overlapping groups. First, of course, World Affairs Council members, but also members of the Pacific Council on International Relations, the Marines Memorial Association, and the Council on Foreign Relations, and our co-sponsors in this event. So welcome to all of you. This is the second part of a mini-series we're doing on Iran, you will hear more about those as the weeks go on. If you want a full copy of the report that's being discussed tonight, go on www.worldaffairs.org and please download it from there. The biographies of your speakers are in your programs, and I ask you to join me in welcoming our moderator tonight, who is Scott Sagan, who is professor at Stanford University and part of the Center for International Studies. Wait, I'm saying it wrong, CSEC, Security and Arms Control. So welcome, Scott Sagan.
I'm Scott Sagan, and on behalf of the World Affairs Council, I will be moderating this event this evening, and it's my pleasure to introduce, once again, the speakers. Ambassador William Luers had a 31-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service and currently serves as the director of the Foundation on Civil Society's Iran Project. Admiral Eric Olson is the former commander of the United States Special Operations Command. Ambassador Frank Wisner had a distinguished career in the Foreign Service, serving as both the U.S. ambassador to India and Egypt, and also was the Undersecretary of Defense and the Undersecretary of State at different times in his career. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming these three distinguished guests this evening.
Thank you, Scott.
And I'm going to start with Ambassador Wisner, because I'd like you, if you could, briefly to put the current crisis with Iran into the context of the recent developments throughout the Middle East.
Scott, I'd be pleased to do so. First of all, let me make certain the mic is carrying my voice. Can I see a hand in the back of the room? Good, thank you. Scott, thank you, first of all, to you and to our hosts this evening, and it's a terrific treat for me to be with Bill Luers, whose commitment to the use of diplomacy to address America's vital interests abroad are matched literally by no one, and who spent 10 years of his life focusing on Iran and how the United States can manage its affairs with Iran. I'm proud to be associated with Bill, with Admiral Olson. All of us and the others who are part of this exercise have found this an extraordinary moment to try to understand and ask all Americans to understand with us what's at stake when we consider the question of Iran. Now, to me, the issue is vital. Iran and the United States, frankly, are more than a nuclear question. It's even more than a question of dealing with Israel. Iran and the United States face a context in a vitally sensitive part of the world, a part of the world that has become even more complex over the past 18 months as a tidal wave of revolution has swept the Middle East and topples governments, provokes the worst kinds of violence in tragic societies like Syria. That process is not over. We will be in the midst of this revolutionary change for a decade or more. And as we think about it and how we are to manage our affairs, it's absolutely vital that we keep in mind why the Middle East continues to matter to us, despite other preoccupations, other interests around the world. At heart, the United States, I would suggest to all of you, has three core interests. The first is hydrocarbons, oil in particular, and the flow of it. It is the lifeblood of international energy commerce. It affects the economies of every region in the world, and indeed our own. It has been uniquely important in American calculations. In the region, it took us to war originally when we reflagged vessels at the time of the Kuwait crisis. Oil, critical. Second, Israel. I make no apologies for a commitment made now decades ago by President Truman that the United States has more than real and practical interests in its relations with Israel and Israel's security and well-being. It has a moral commitment to the survival and the well-being of the State of Israel. Third, which is an ancient preoccupation, the Middle East sits at the center of power in the world. The United States has sought to make certain that we're not excluded from that we can influence events in the region, for that region projects or destabilizes other regions in the world. Now, when I had the honor and pleasure of serving Secretary Shultz, we were in a different age. We were at a time in which the United States had a dominant voice in the Middle East. We were the primus inter pares would be, to put it mildly. But in the last decade, all of us have got to be frank, Scott, and recognize that the balance of power in the region has shifted. And it shifted and put us on a plane of competition and sharing of power with others in the region. And that shift is absolutely vital, that we change our strategy, our tactics, and think about how we are going to deal with the emerging regional actors, Iran, Turkey, the older players are there. Egypt is coming back. The balance in the region no longer permits the United States to articulate its ambitions and state and convene, even as we were able to do at Madrid some years ago in trying to address the intractable questions of Palestine and, and Israel. Now, what I appeal to all of you is to think, therefore, in the context of why Iran matters. And I will argue with you tonight a self-evident proposition that Iran is central to every American concern in the Middle East. From the hydrocarbons issue, sitting on that vital access from the Caspian Sea down to the Persian Gulf, oil is very much an issue that Iran influences in price and the stability of supply, and therefore the economy of the globe. Oil, the Gulf, the freedom of the Gulf, the ability to navigate that very narrow band of water is absolutely vital. We need to understand Iran, Iran us, if we're to avoid conflict, but more importantly, to assure the use of the Gulf. But it's more than just the Gulf, it's the littoral states along the edge of the Gulf, the stability of rather fragile nations, the Kuwaits, the UAE, the Omans, Qatar's, Bahrain's, even Saudi Arabia. These are nations whose fates are intimately linked with Iran and with our presence and policy and our ability to deal with Iran. So the Gulf, hydrocarbons third. Let's think a bit further. Afghanistan. Can you really think about Afghanistan without thinking about Iran? Not just the safety and security of American forces while they are still in combat on the ground. That's important. But what about after 2014? When America's responsibility with the departure of our military forces does not go away? Instead, it only continues, but will change into a political framework. And there we will need understandings with Iran if we are to have any hope of seeing stability, at a modicum of stability, pertain in a post-American withdrawal Afghanistan. Syria, we're watching the tragedy unfold today. Can any of us in our minds not argue the crisis ends? Can we argue the crisis ends when Bashar al-Assad leaves Damascus? No, it's the beginning of an enormously serious problem that can affect the entire region. Iran has a major stake in what happens in Syria. It's been a major Iranian play. Iran has a say in what the outcome in Syria will be. We need to be able to relate to Iran. It's not easy to do so. Kofi Annan tried to do so. We were uneasy with that sense of engagement with Iran. But frankly, I have to say to you, I cannot see how Syria can be managed without including Iran in the equation. So, I won't go on and belabor the point, but I want to make three simple closing arguments about the necessity to remain engaged in the region. Means there is a necessity to deal with Iran on the broadest possible basis, not just on nuclear questions, and not just through the prism of Israeli security, important as that is, but on the basis of the broadest set of American concerns. We cannot protect ourselves if we don't achieve a live and let live, a modus vivendi with Iran in the region, and that is going to require engagement. Engagement with Iran, the setting of objectives and the pursuit of those. We need to pursue the individual issues. I've outlined several today. And in the end of the day, and I hope when a new administration arrives in Washington, that we'll set even bolder ambition, and that is to aim for a framework of security in the Gulf and in the Middle East, much like the CSCE operation in Europe followed and helped contain the last years of the Cold War, in which the stability of the region can be discussed among its inhabitants. But the core lies in our being able to talk to Iran, to have Iran recognize the legitimacy of American interests in the region, and we recognize the legitimacy of Iran's presence, not presuming on one or the other's internal domestic order or form of government, but dealing with the facts of the region on the basis of mutual respect and mutual recognition of legitimacy. Thanks, and let me turn the floor over
Thank
to
you, Ambassador.
Admiral Olson.
Well, let's turn to you, Admiral Olson. As a retired four-star, could you outline for us the current U.S. capabilities in the region, and as you do in this very important paper, discuss the pros and cons of using military force in such a situation as we have with Iran today?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. First, let me say thank you for moderating this. Thanks to the ambassadors on my right and left for letting me join them. Thanks to Jane and the World Affairs Council for letting us be with you tonight, and thanks to all of you for being here and engaging in this way. This is certainly a most important issue and certainly a most complex issue of our time. I don't claim any real expertise on Iran. I've never been there. I know few Iranians. I've spent some time thinking about Iran, but certainly in a different way than my two colleagues tonight from the diplomatic corps have been thinking about Iran. I don't claim any real academic credentials, and my military credentials are different than many of my military colleagues. I served in the United States Special Operations Forces, organized mostly into small units, deployed in many remote places. They did not have the advantage of mass to overpower their adversaries. They did not have direct control of complex military weapon systems to address their potential adversaries, and they rarely owned the terrain on which they sat. So they had to come up with a different way of approaching the problems in the places where they were. There was a depth to their thinking, a cleverness to their approach, trying to find non-traditional means to accomplish their objectives. And that's what brings me to this project. In the sort of fundamentals of the military triad of shoot, move, communicate, a simplified way for military people to talk about the essential skills that they must have. There is doctrine written around that. There is training written around shooting, moving, and communicating. And my position is that that's insufficient. It helps deal with tactically addressing an adversary. It has to do with employing what I call the platform-based capabilities of the military, but it doesn't quite get us to the knowledge-based capabilities of the military, the understanding of the context of a place, the operational complexities of a place, the potential consequences of military action in a place. So I think about it in terms of shoot, move, communicate, shoot, move, communicate, understand. But then it strikes me as we've got those in exactly the wrong order. It is understand, and I mean deeply understand, richly, broadly understand what it is we are doing, where we are, and what the and understand so that we can accurately predict, wherever possible, the consequences of our actions and behavior. Then you're more likely to get your communications right, you're more likely to get your movement right, and when and if it is necessary to shoot, you're more likely to be shooting at the right things for the right reasons, with a specific intent and with some ability to measure whether or not your intent was accomplished. So let me talk about military planning for a minute. Military planning is comprehensive, it is robust. Military planners are noted for planning and planning and planning. When military isn't fighting, it's planning for some operation, some complexity, some conflict, some contingency. And these plans are very, very carefully developed in several phases to take one through the duration of a conflict from pre-massive actions to transition at the end. They are refreshed every couple of years. They are analyzed in great detail. And my contention is that we really begin our planning at the wrong place. The war games in which I've participated, the exercises in which I've participated as a military member, generally start with a question, we've just had this crisis, what do we do next? And my argument now is that the first question in each of these war games should be, we just had this crisis, what might we have done 10 years ago to prevent us from being here today dealing with this crisis? And I'm becoming convinced that prevention of conflict is not a passive activity. It takes real effort, it takes structure, it takes much more than the Department of Defense in our government to deal with preventing conflict, and that there ought to be a phase -1 to all of our plans crafted by a different organization in order to consciously address the issue of conflict prevention. And then third, I believe that there is a space between where classic diplomacy ends and where traditional military operations begin. And I think we too often cross that space too quickly. I believe that there is much to explore in that gap. A variety of actions that can be undertaken by a variety of elements of our national power. Some of them may be distasteful, but they may be less distasteful than crossing too quickly to traditional military operations. And it is in the context of all of that that I have associated myself with this project. I won't get tonight into any specific military intelligence. I won't get tonight into any specific military capabilities, but I do want to be associated with this paper, whose intent is to stimulate deep, robust thinking about a very complex issue. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ambassador Luers.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Admiral. Ambassador, I think he teed you up clearly. Why don't you tell us about the purpose of the paper and what you believe its main messages are? And again, this is available on the Council's website, Weighing Benefits and Costs of Military Action Against Iran. Ambassador
Thank you,
Luers.
Scott. Thank you for coming and helping us think through these things and help us tell our story. And Jane, always a pal, thank you for being here and giving us this space. And I guess I have to say that we're in the presence of our boss, Secretary Shultz, who is, most of us who worked under him have great admiration for him, and we're scared to death of him.
We do know that Secretary George Shultz gets the first question once we open it up.
Please. Anyway, this project sets out to say, we've got a problem. Let's figure out what is the basis of that problem. And in going around in Washington over the last 6 months, talking to senators and congressmen, and particularly to a number of senior military officers now serving and recently left the service, I came across a phenomena that much of what our group, the Iran Project, has been thinking and talking about for these decade-long effort. You heard Eric. Admiral Olson can talk about these issues in ways that I admire, and it's helped me think through a lot of the questions that we face as we wonder whether we should go use military action against Iran. A president who, virtually every president I went through, and many of the quotes are in this book, all of them had, at one point in their career, in their life, an appeal to the American people to reason together on a decision that was to be taken. And your president kept saying, facts are stubborn things. We've tried to, our president, Reagan, kept saying that. It was one of his favorite expressions, which he took from John Adams, by the way. We found that one of the most interesting quotes that I have is by the president who won the Nobel Prize for Peace before he even really became president. part of our challenge is reconciling these two seemingly irreconcilable truths, that war is sometimes necessary, and war at some level is an expression of human folly. So I guess our effort in this publication and bringing this group together of 35 senior officials of government, all of whom share in this common objective of bringing the facts to the people and trying to do it without prejudice, without recommendations, and without any political influence whatsoever. It's a nonpartisan statement. Now, what have we done? Our objective in this is to say, when you think about the use of military force, you want to think about what are the objectives. And Eric referred to this. What do you want to achieve by using military force? If in this case you want to achieve a delay in Iran's ability to build a nuclear weapon, if we determine that they're planning to do that, then you can delay it for 4 years if that's your objective. If your objective is to permanently eliminate Iran's capability of getting a nuclear weapon, you probably can't achieve that objective through airstrikes and through related activities not involved with forces on the ground. If your objective is to bring about regime change, which you hear about in Washington, that once you begin the bombing, you can bring about results that really will achieve the end of this government, which we don't like and don't live well with and is a threat to the region. You can't achieve that objective of regime change through bombing. History tells us that, and the nature of this government does. Nor can you bring them to capitulation. So what do you want to achieve in the bombing? And if you really want to achieve the delay in the nuclear capacity, and that may very well be a valid objective, you should do it. Nobody on this group is against the use of military force. All of these people have recognized that we may have to use it. We may have to use something short of military force, as Eric was suggesting, which we're already using at some level. But then once you've made that decision, what would be the benefits you'd get from it? Assuming you do attack, you would seriously damage all their nuclear facilities. They have 6 declared facilities, and we could probably, including even Fardo, which is their 300 feet underground, we could probably damage or destroy every one of them, which would take them out of service for a long time. We would weaken their ability to rebuild their nuclear facilities. You could probably do damage to places where they're building their centrifuges. You could eliminate the plant that we think is going up to have plutonium. You could damage their military capabilities, and you could really have a broader benefit of demonstrating to our allies in the region, particularly Israel, but also many of the Arab countries in the Gulf, that we stand with them and we understand their concerns about Iran's potential of getting a bomb and of being a threat, even a greater threat than they already are to the region. And those would all be positive for U.S. interests in the region. On the other hand, we talk about the costs. And it's interesting that the costs, the costs of this are more difficult to evaluate than the benefits, because the benefits are real and now and can be predicted based on the effectiveness of your force. The costs, however, become short-term. Clearly, there are people who will be killed in the retaliation. There would be the problems that would come from not knowing what retaliation the Iranians would take. Presumably, it would be asymmetrical, and they would undertake lots of efforts with the Quds Force and their covert operations and terrorism around the world. I guess the issues that most of us feel is that an initial cost could be, no matter what the reason we do it for, but if we decide to do it, you have the danger of escalation. You don't know how they're going to react. You don't know what impact their reactions will have on U.S. interests other than Israel. whether Americans will be killed. And once you get into that fog of war, you have a situation where you can't predict the outcome. And one of the most concerning outcomes from all of us is the escalation that you can't manage, that you have an escalated a war in the region that involves Hezbollah, Hamas, a Palestinian intifada. You have, and Syria is already in its own problems, but you have the possibility of a regional war that the region doesn't need right now, another regional war, never mind the U.S. So we went through these issues and we wrote them out without any judgment. In fact, there were a lot of moments in which we negotiated, and every one of these people who signed this document, including Brent Scowcroft and Brzezinski, Sam Nunn, Lee Hamilton, Chuck Hagel, and never mind so many of the others who were experts in the area, and two of the admirals were particularly attentive to every detail. And I want you to know this what has emerged is a statement that reflects the general thinking of all these people who signed it, and there are many more who didn't sign it who agree with the proposition that America should have a discussion about this that is not political, that is apolitical, that is serious, because we want to go down this road again. I went to a senator, a very senior senator, and said, we're publishing this document soon. Would you have joint hearings of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Armed Services Committee so we can have a balanced discussion in the center of American politics on this issue? He said, on the one hand, he can't possibly do it because if he did it now, it would suggest to the President of the United States that the Democratic Senate is opposed to his effort to establish credibility to the Iranians that he will be prepared to use military force. He said, but on the other hand, Bill, had we had such hearings in 2002, before we went into Iraq, we may never have gone. He was, in other words, encouraging us to make this effort, but for the time being having to dissociate himself from it. We hope you'll understand our reluctance to get into policy issues, to make recommendations. We think that the way we've written this, the way we've cast it, and the people who've associated with it are saying to all of you, think seriously and understand the issues. As Eric said, before you do anything, understanding comes first. And we're afraid that the way it's been discussed over the last 6 months particularly, that it's seen as something quick and easy and maybe something that won't have long-term consequences. We just think we all have to look at that and carefully understand it, and we think this paper helps you do it.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Luers. Before I turn to the questions from the audience, I would like a point of clarification. This is a very valuable paper, and I really do encourage all of you to read it. But you make an assumption, or at least an estimate in the paper, that a large-scale U.S. attack would delay the Iranian program by about 4 years, and that an Israeli attack, largely because they lack some of the bunker buster capabilities that our advanced weaponry has, could could delay the program by approximately 2 years. And you make a quite provocative, counterintuitive, interesting argument that an American attack may well make an Iranian bomb in the long term more likely, not less likely. Which one of you would like to explain that counterintuitive proposition?
Bill, go ahead.
Answering this, the second point, this was a subject that almost everybody agreed on. That we know, and the intelligence community says repeatedly, as well as IAEA, and as well as the Israelis, that we know they've not made a decision to make a bomb, and you ask the head of intelligence in the United States and in Israel, they say, "Are you sure?" They said, "We're confident." Now, I don't know how they know. They say they know. The question is, will they make that decision? They're looked at more carefully than any other country in the world on this issue. They believe that the Israelis and we are ready to attack them. And under these circumstances, there is a possibility that they won't ever do it, or they won't do it for a long time. However, if we attack as a preemptive measure to make sure they don't do it, the paradox is that they will say, we must, there's no choice. And it will turn around what we believe to be a long period of preparation without doing it. We absolutely believe that they want to be where Japan is, capable of doing it quickly, but not having done it or made the decision. Your first question.
It was about the assumption
The
that
4 years,
a delay would be 4 years if the U.S. attacked and 2 years if
There are
Israel
footnotes in here. By the way, there are a lot of footnotes because a lot of the issues were highly disputed. And on this issue, we have several long footnotes that describe the methodology that several non-political professionals have done. And it's based somewhat on Fardo. It took about 4 years for them to build this facility near Qom, which is where they're doing their 20% enrichment,
Right.
which is about 200, 300 feet underground through granite, through rock, heavy rock. And we know it took about 4 years. We can do great damage to Fordo. For them to build another facility that was of that scale and importance and that secure.
So the 4 years are based not on reconstituting that facility, but rather
They
on
couldn't.
building
If we
a new
damage
facility.
it, they can't reconstitute it.
I understand, okay.
And the question is, can we damage it? We have these bunker buster bombs, which if you drop them 4 in a row on top of in the same place, you probably can destroy the whole facility. It's complicated, and you have to be accurate. But the military believe it could happen. The Israelis, when they attacked these 6 facilities, Natanz and Fordo are the 2 biggest where you have enrichment. And the Israelis believe they can't get Fordo, so they won't be able to do that kind of damage. So the return that they'll get is not as high as ours.
And then why the 2-year assumption for them?
The 2-year assumption was based on the fact that they will be able to take out Natanz and the 2 facilities where they're actually preparing the gas that goes into the facilities, into the centrifuges.
Right.
And without the flow of gas and without that facility, it's going to take them a while to rebuild it. And if they build it underground, it will take even longer. So.
Okay, thank you.
Scott, the
Yes,
other point
please.
you made is
Admiral.
the paper raises the possibility that a military attack may actually contribute to exactly the actions that it would be intended to prevent. And I'll just say that planning is based, it starts with assumptions. And an assumption that Iran would be less inspired to develop a weapon because of an attack, or maybe more inspired to develop a weapon because of an attack, is just left open for debate. And I think that's really the beauty of this paper, is it does present these kinds of facts and issues for deeper discussion.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I have an excellent set of questions here that have been passed to me from the audience, but it is a rare pleasure to have a former Secretary of State in the audience. And so, George Shultz, I wonder if you would like to ask the first question. Otherwise, I'll turn to these. Do we have a hand mic, or should I repeat? Speak loudly, and I will. Okay.
I think this effort is really impressive, and I compliment the people who've undertaken it. I have a different view on what we should do about Iran, different than has been taken in a while. I think, first of all, this business of they haven't made a decision yet is ridiculous. They're putting themselves in a position where they can do something. I look at what people's capabilities are. They can change their mind back and forth. But if they're capable of doing it, there must be some reason why they want that capability. And I notice that after the Israelis took out the Iraqi nuclear reactor, maybe it made Saddam Hussein even more anxious, but he didn't build a nuclear weapon. And the Syrian reactor, nobody's complaining that the Israelis took that out. But with Iran, they have for a long time been attacking the United States in a lethal way. They provided arms, training, and some people in both Iraq and Afghanistan that killed Americans. What do we do about it? Nothing. They tried to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in Washington. What did we do about it? Nothing. We have given them the message that they can do anything, and we won't do anything in response. So I think we have to say, we're willing to act in our self-defense. Here's an example. During 1986, Iran was messing with Kuwaiti shipping. So we reflagged the ships to American flags so we could defend them. And while the president of Iran was in the United Nations saying the last thing in the world Iran would do would put a mine in the Persian Gulf, our Navy was taking pictures of them doing it. Then we boarded the ship, we took off some mines for evidence, we took off the sailors, we sank the ship, we took the sailors to Dubai and said to Iran, come and get your sailors and cut it out. There was no loss of life, incidentally. But there was a clear message to Iran, look, we know what you're doing, and we're willing to do something about it. I think that kind of action, which is described in a very good book by a man named Abe Sofair, is the sort of thing we should be doing, and there are plenty of targets that don't give you this all or nothing kind of posture. Then I think, and I believe I'm here agreeing very much with Frank, we should have a different attitude toward our diplomacy toward Iran. When I was in office, we had something called the Iranian Claims Court. It still exists. And I assigned Abe Sofair, you all know him, one of our top guys, to represent us. Interestingly, the Iranians assigned a very top person. And these two guys could go to The Hague. Nobody paid any attention. They do their lawyering, but then we could have a professional exchange. I think it should have been expanded. And just as in dealing with the Soviet Union, we didn't like them. They were our enemies. They were heavily armed. They were a threat. But we didn't say, therefore, we won't negotiate with them. We said, yes, we'll sit down with them. We'll be realistic. Don't kid yourself. But sit down and see if you can't work something out on a broad basis, not just on the nuclear issues. In the Soviet case, arms control, but other things, human rights, regional issues, bilateral things we talked about. So I think we should be expanding our sights as to the type of diplomacy we want to undertake, but we should also be demonstrating to Iran that they can't keep getting away literally with murder and we don't do anything about it. So that's what I think.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. For those on the radio, that was former Secretary of State George Shultz. I've got a wonderful set of questions here, and let me start with one that
Briefly,
you have a chance to have a brief
I mean,
response, Bill.
as all of us have a tremendous admiration for Secretary Shultz, and he has always been a man who is committed to his country, knowledgeable about what we need, and passionate about the pursuit of that. Frankly, George, my passion right now is to take out as much of the bias that you can possibly take out and look at this coldly about what do we get if we carry out what Abe has said, and will it return the benefits that we think? This paper doesn't address Abe's very good book, very thoughtful book, but what we're asking is, before we get to that point that you're suggesting, we know what it means, and will it deliver? Mac Bundy was asked by his biographer in the mid-90s, years after the Vietnam War, what is it that, what's the biggest surprise you had during the Vietnam War? His answer the next morning, he couldn't get this stuff out, his answer the next morning was, my surprise was the endurance of the enemy and my underestimation of the endurance of the enemy and my overestimation of the power of coercion. That he didn't know that the Vietnamese would bear up under so much attack over so long a period of time. And he basically believed that coercion ultimately is going to be effective. Now, I guess this paper is trying to say, think it through, be cool about this, but be passionately cool and get it right. We can't get it wrong. If we have to go this route, we've got to go and we've got to get the job done and take the consequences which we know are going to be a result. And that's where I come out.
Thank you, Ambassador. The first question refers to the title of the overall session today, is War with Iran Inevitable? Because it asks, given the reports of cyber attacks, assassination of Iranian scientists, sabotage recently of power lines to the uranium enrichment facilities, aren't we already at war with Iran?
Well, I believe, as I look at the situation before all of us today, that we are in a period of enormous danger. There is no doubt in my mind, as Washington has articulated its own case, the possibility of an Israeli military attack is very real, and that the diplomacy of the president, his approach has been to try to make it clear that we will not live with a nuclear weapon, but that we would have the opportunity to deploy all other means short of a full-scale military offensive. Can I tell you today, Scott, that whether Israel will attack before or after the elections, I really can't tell you anything more than to draw your attention back to where we sit and what is the assumption in Washington. This is a very dangerous period. But does that mean there aren't options? Are there alternatives? Are we on an inevitable track to war? Here, Bill's Iran project that I'm proud to be part of enters in, and it asks each one of you, everyone in this room, to think through what we would do as Americans and what are the right choices to make. I've read this paper, and I'm going to add my own appeal to all of you. I wish I'd had it in my hands before we engaged in Iraq and have a chance to make the decisions based on a very careful balance of the judgments before us. So I'll tell you today we're in a dangerous period, but I do not want to say that despite those levels of danger, that war is inevitable. And I do believe we as a republic have time to think through our choices very carefully.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vassar. Frank's given his view. Do others want to add in on this question?
The definition of war is pretty soft. There are certainly elements of conflict with Iran, and some of them are costly on both sides. But they are actions that, in my view, are in that gap. They are beyond classic diplomacy, but they are short of full-force military operations. And as distasteful as some of them are, as painful as some of them are, if we talk about war with Iran as being the traditional notion of war, then this paper doesn't take a position on whether it's inevitable or not. It simply says that that in the debate about the costs and benefits, that some of these actions in that gap ought to be considered.
Thank you. A second question, in fact, two or three of them address the question of what are the red lines that we would like Iran not to cross? What is the current U.S. position about a red line? Should it be clarified in a different way, or is it beneficial to have some ambiguity about what lines you do not want an adversary to cross?
Frank, you're good at this one.
Well, I'm not sure I'm particularly good at it, but I have a very strong feeling that our president, any responsible statesman, must be very careful before he traces red lines. He needs to be able to operate in a zone of ambiguity that gives him the freedom of choice and the ability to adapt to a set of circumstances that he's presented with, and not to declare in advance, lest he finds himself pushed to those and have no room for maneuver. The president's position is clear, and he stated it. We can accept that. But to go beyond it and then define red lines, to me, is very unwise. But I had a thought, Scott, for all of you to ponder. Our definition of what is the threat and Israel's definition of what is the threat is not necessarily the same. We have tended to think in terms of a bomb or a series of bombs. Is that really the issue? Israel tends to look at red lines surrounding a capability on the assumption that the greatest threat is not the use of a military weapon by Iran, but Iran having a military capability that increases Iran's political influence and gives Iran the power to threaten Israel in an existential sense, to encourage others to take chances with Israel's security, to change Iran's posture inside the region. Now, that's an ambiguous but vitally important question for Israel, not subject to a facile definition of red lines. Our sense has been more classically a weapon. We've talked about this. Bill Luers has mentioned how we look at where the weapon issue stands today. So because our objectives and our assumptions are different, and the correct way to approach a problem is not through definitions that get you into trouble, I would avoid and think we're quite right to avoid the use of red lines.
I'd simply say that
Admiral Olson, please.
Yeah, I'd simply say that most senior military commanders will tell you that that their professions were focused on providing additional options for national decision makers, and I certainly wouldn't recommend anything that would nibble away at the freedom of decision and action, which setting red lines may do.
Well, that actually tees up one of the other questions specifically for you, Admiral, which is what has been discussed in the paper is a large-scale attack against nuclear sites in Iran. What are the costs and what are the benefits? And it includes many other attacks. People ask, what about surgical strikes, the way that Israel did against the Syrian reactor and Israel did against the Iraqi reactor in an earlier period of time?
Yeah, Scott, I'm just not going to go down that road. The paper is not about comparing alternatives, and in this forum, and which is about the paper, I'm not going to talk about how one military option might play out against a different one.
Okay.
Well, the one thing, we don't want to go there.
Bill Luers.
I will say that in the case of Iran, they have facilities everywhere. You know, Iraq had one, Syria and Iraq had one place, out in the middle of the desert, standing out like a big sore thumb.
One reactor, in neither case fully loaded up.
Yeah, exactly. They got rid of it.
A very different kind of operation.
Yeah, yeah. The idea of surgical strike, given the air defenses they have, the retaliation capacity they have, and their clear intention to use some of the retaliation capacity they have, it's just a different situation. It's a different situation.
Another set of questions deal with an even broader range of regional actors than the Afghan, Arab Spring, Israeli focus, saying that India also has relations with Iran different than ours. Frank, as a former ambassador to India, would you like to comment on how U.S.-India ties influence the way we should be thinking about Iran today?
Well, it's an important, albeit secondary, point. India has deep and long-standing ties with Iran, based on the fact that Iran has been India's principal petroleum supplier, and that India has always used the position of Iran to counterbalance Pakistan, and India has used Iran specifically to be able to get to Afghanistan, where India has developed a very extensive network of commitments that it wishes to continue and stabilize the regime in Kabul. So India has many ties to Iran. However, let's be careful. The Indians are quite aware that there are international sanctions that have been arrayed against Iran, and India is determined to respect those. India is reducing its oil intake from Iran, oil imports from Iran, and it is made clear that it will have no strategic cooperation, joint military developments, and other things of that sort with Iran, and it will not allow the use of its companies to violate UN sanctions. So the Indians have turned to us and said, recognize our vulnerability, recognize our long-standing ties, let us evolve. We are going to follow an international standard. We should respect that. In my judgment, our ties to India are of a geostrategic nature, and we should give the Indians time to adapt to the sanctions regimes, but make it absolutely clear that we expect that adaptation to take place.
Okay. Thank you. I have a question for both Ambassador Wisner and Ambassador Luers. One of the questioners notes that in 2003, a U.S. Defense Department official was quoted as saying the lesson that Iran should get from the invasion of Iraq is take a number, you're next in line. And this questioner also notes that the United States helped engineer the overthrow of an elected prime minister in the 1950s. So the question is, how much of this problem with Iran is our own making?
Well, you know,
I told you weren't going to
the
get easy questions
relationship,
here.
yeah, it's a good, the relationship between the two countries, both countries have made big mistakes, and there is the argument that they make that the direct line between the coup against Mossadegh in 1953 goes directly to Khamenei's revolution, that the frustration over time that built into the system of the Shah brought this about. That's their argument. There's some validity to it, and our treatment of Iran, particularly our support for Iran, for Iraq against Iran, including not criticizing Iraq for using chemical weapons against Iran during their 8-year war, and many others. If you listen to Iranians before you get down to the business of life, what you're going to talk to them about, they'll speak for 20 minutes or an hour if you give them on the subject of their problems. But that's not to say that they haven't done really dreadful things to the United States, beginning with the hostages and the activity they conducted in Iraq against U.S. forces, the presumed activity they're conducting really in other parts of the world against U.S. interests, their preparations for what must be a nuclear program that we think will lead to a bomb at some point, possibly. The threatening role they play in the region, their threat to Israel. These are all other aspects of the problem. It's a mutually difficult relationship that's gone on without talking for 30 years. And our ultimately, which is not in this paper nor in the scope of this paper, but we can't reach an understanding of what the problem is with Iran until we talk to them about it.
Do you want to add anything to that, Frank?
No, I agree with Bill. I think the question is very well put, because it does remind us that there are two sides to this story, that Iranians have a perception of the United States, the Mossadegh period, Iranian history, the axis of evil, continuing congressional actions to fund Iranian opposition. All of these give lively cause, and we have our concerns. Very clearly, the Iranians have been engaged in actions that have taken the lives of Americans. The threats Iran has placed around the region, and particularly against Israel and the security and future of Israel. So we have a set of real problems, often domestically driven. We're almost in ways that are mirror images. Our politics drive us to extremes. And the hard job is to try to begin to understand what motivates the Iranians, what motivates ourselves, what the issues are, and then find a way to circle those issues and negotiate them, put them on the table. And it is, I argued at the outset, more than simply coming to an understanding about the nuclear question. It is about how we in Iran live with one another in a region.
We have time for one more question. And it's one that's a bit outside the scope of the study, but I hope that you can address it nonetheless, because no less than 3 people asked it in their cards coming up. And it all refers to containment. Given the success of containment, nuclear containment, with the Soviet Union, with China, and thus far with North Korea, what are the pros and cons of accepting containment of a nuclear Iran?
You know, I don't understand what that means in the case of Iran, because containment with the Soviet Union, as defined by George Kennan, was another issue. It was containing communism,
The spread of
and the
Soviet
spread
power.
of communist Soviet power. It wasn't about nuclear. It never was about nuclear. And in fact, we worked, I mean, much of my life and Secretary Schultz's life was devoted to how do you get at that issue, but it was part of a broader relationship that was huge. And it wasn't the only nature, it was the most dangerous part. So containment really began before they really had a nuclear arsenal. Now, could you have a containment of Iran, of isolating it from the region, and deal with nuclear? They're locked into their relationships with every country around them. So if containment means only nuclear, I wouldn't associate myself with that policy, because that's not what this paper is all about. If containment means what I think of as containment is trying to protect the region from the Islamic Revolution, from their influence, from their nefarious doings in many countries in the region, I don't see how that's possible. You know, so that's my problem with that term, containment. I don't know, Frank, if you...
No, there's only the rather obvious additional comment that I think in the president's use or rejection of the use of the word containment, he was saying we are not going to stand idly by while Iran acquires a nuclear weapon. We're not going to contain an existing weapon. We want to see Iran stop on the other side of a weapon. And that, in that sense,
And he
it's
said,
a rather narrow
I've got your
definition.
back, to the Prime Minister of Israel. But if you change the term to mutual nuclear deterrence, rather than containment,
That still assumes that you have agreed that Iran could have a nuclear weapon.
that is what the questioner is asking.
And we have not, the official policy of the United States is that we are not prepared to accept that outcome.
Correct. And the questioner
Do
is
you have to
asking why.
accept, do you have to deal with the hypothetical situation? I am not convinced they're going to go for a nuclear weapon in my lifetime. I'm pretty old. And I'm not convinced that they will want to build a nuclear weapon, even if they thought it was appropriate, because they're being watched. There's no place as inspected as they are. And by the way, IAEA is all over their place. You know, the IAEA, they have monitors on everything they do. They know how much enriched uranium they have. They know how they visit every one of these sites in person, once a month, once every 2 months.
And they have cameras there.
Yeah,
when
they have
the
monitors
inspectors are not
everywhere.
there.
And so we know so much about their program. And if they decided that they wanted to do that, to go for weapons grade enrichment, it would take them about a month to get what they need, and they'd have to signal it. They couldn't do it without the IAEA knowing about it. I guess the long-term goal is to make sure they don't go down that road. And if you plan for them going down that road, you may make it happen. So we don't address that issue in here, as we've talked before. And
Right.
It's unsatisfactory, I know, and it's an important issue, but we don't address it here.
Admiral, perhaps I could give you the last word on any last thoughts that you would like to impart about the risks of using military force and how we should be thinking about that as an American democracy.
I would just say read the paper. I mean, that's the title of the paper, is the benefits and costs of military action. And so rather than sort of brief the paper here tonight, which would be the answer to the question, I just encourage you to read it.
Great. Well, that does conclude our program for tonight. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you to join me in thanking Ambassador William Luers, Ambassador Frank Wisner, and Admiral Olson for this wonderful discussion. So thank you to the audience as well.